What made 9-year-old Jennet Devize accuse her mother and siblings of witchcraft in 17th century England? Find out about the Pendle Witch Trials of 1612 on this episode of Footnoting History. Hello, Footnoting History friends, it's Kristin. Back to kick off spooky season with a bit of witchcraft history from early modern Europe. Although, I'm going to be honest, it's always spooky season if you're like me. So if you're listening to this on release day or not, doesn't matter. Welcome to The Witch Show. And in this episode, we're going to be focusing on one of the more curious cases, I think, to come out of England during the height of the witch craze. And for England, its biggest witch incident. I'm certainly not alone. Historians love this one, and people at the time loved it too, or were fascinated by it, or were scared to death of it, or all of the above. Don't forget that if you'd like a captioned version of this episode, you can find it on our YouTube channel or on our website. And if you can't get enough of the Pendle Witches, and who really can, you can find a bibliography of further reading at footnotinghistory.com. I'm going to slightly change up the order of how I usually do things by telling you the story of the Pendle Witches and then tell you something about the source material, the How We Know What We Know segment that Kristin is so fond of, as are many of you. So don't worry, we'll get to the sources, I promise. The Pendle Witch Trials are also called the Lancashire Witch Trials. And as things go, they're pretty famous, most especially in Lancashire, where the castle where the witches were held still stands. The well tower where they were imprisoned still has iron rings on the walls where accused and convicted witches were shackled. And a lot of the surrounding landscape, roads and a pub, was there in 1612 when it all went down. And kind of like Salem, the town really leans into its witch history. And there are witchy boutiques and lots of merch and tours, some better than others, just FYI. Lancashire is a county in England, sort of in the northwestern upper third of England, a bit above Wales, a bit below Scotland, and Pendle sits inland on the eastern end of the county. It's a stunning area of rolling hills and woods and rivers, and take a Google Earth tour. It's worth it just for the atmosphere of the story I'm about to tell you. So it all began on March 21st, 1612, when young Jennet Devize came across a peddler named John Law. Allison's last name is spelled variously in the sources with a CZ, a ZE, and an SE, but her first name is always Allison with a Z. John the peddler was selling pins. Allison demanded he give her one. It's unclear if she wanted to pay for it or not, and John refused for one reason or another, and Allison cursed him. Immediately, John fell down in a fit that was later described as caused by Allison's witchcraft, and John, who survived the attack, pressed charges with the local justice of the peace, a man named Roger Nowell, and thus began the legal proceedings. The first people questioned were Allison and her mother Elizabeth and her brother James. John Law's son Abraham was also questioned. In the arraignment, Abraham is described as assisting his father who could not stand on his own in court. Abraham said he got a letter from his father, who was paralyzed on his left side, all but his eye, and who couldn't speak. Abraham came, and his father recovered enough to tell him that Allison had pricked him with knives, elsons. Elson is a word for an awl, which is a little stabby tool for making holes in leather. And she pricked him with sickles. And you know what a sickle is if you've ever seen a drawing of the Grim Reaper. It's that thing he's carrying. At least I hope you've only seen a picture of him. And it just went from there. As these things so often went, interrogations led to more people being named and being caught up in the drama. And this case was no different. Notably, Allison's grandmother, also named Elizabeth, but who was known around town as Old Demdike, was questioned, as was their neighbor Anne Whittle, who also was known as Chaddix. I know you're wondering what those nicknames mean. I did too. Demdike means demon woman. So yeah, this goes to show you that Grandma had a pretty witchy reputation already. That is usually the case with these trials. People have an established reputation, sometimes going back years, and when you see them in court, it's not their first rodeo. The nickname Chattox is a little more unclear. It could be another word for mumbler or chatterer, because this lady was known for muttering to herself a lot, or it could be a variation of the last name Chadwick, but she is described as always walking around talking to herself, so if I had to guess, I'd guess that one, but I really don't know for certain. Turns out that Chattox was in a family feud with the Devizes, which is, again, kind of how these things often go. Allison confessed to being a witch. She then accused her neighbors, who then turned the finger back to Demdike. There ended up being a lot of confessions, which the sources label as voluntary, but how voluntary they really were, I have my doubts. Allison, Demdike, Chattox, and Chattox's daughter Anne were arrested and sent to await trial in Lancashire Castle. The trial would happen at the next meeting of the assizes, which were periodic legal proceedings that happened in the counties of England, and the next one was scheduled for August of 1612. The arrests were April 4th, so they had months to wait. They were not wealthy people, and they could not afford to pay to improve their confinement or get better food, so their stay was not a pleasant one. According to the sources, a few days later, on April 10th, Elizabeth Devize, Allison's mother and Demdike's daughter, made the interesting decision to host a party on Good Friday in the family home, which was called Malkin Tower. Malkin Tower seems to no longer exist, I looked. In some of the source material, it's described as being in the Pendle Forest. That's all we really know, but that sounds pretty on brand for a witch meetup spot to me, and it seems it sounded that way to people at the time, too. Maybe it was a party, maybe it was just a gathering to debrief on the arrests, but it didn't look good, and the rumor was the witches were plotting to blow up the tower at the castle where their colleagues were being held with gunpowder. And it's 1612. It isn't so very far away from the more famous Guy Fawkes gunpowder plot to blow up the Parliament in 1605. That may be why gunpowder was on the mind. Personally, I wonder why Elizabeth would want to help Chattox and her daughter, but that reasoning is not explained. People first heard about this Malkin meeting at the further questioning of Elizabeth and then her other two children, Jennet and James. And they all talked about the Malkin meeting, and more names were added and the witch circle widened, and even more people were arrested. This was turning into a major witchcraft panic. More justices of the peace became involved and the accusations were flying, and some of them were about things that had happened years earlier. And although Lancashire tends to get top billing, there were people in Salisbury and arguably one woman in York who were part of this witchcraft episode. The trials happened on August 18th and 19th, 1612 at the Lancaster Assizes, as promised. The guys in charge, the judges, were Sir Edward Bromley and Sir James Altham. Bromley was about 50 years old, and he was very active in the Elizabethan Jacobean legal scene. He worked at the Inns of Court, he also worked at the Exchequer, and he had a few stints as an MP in Parliament. Altham was about 10 years older and had a similar CV. In July of 1612, they were sitting at the Assizes of York. These towns are not very close to one another, but it's England, so nothing is that far away. And also, that's how assize courts worked. The judges were itinerant and they moved around. In those York sessions, Bromley and Altham oversaw the trial of a woman named Jennet Preston for witchcraft. So when they got to Lancaster a few weeks later, they were ready to go. On August 18th, Elizabeth, her son James, Chattox, and Chattox's daughter Anne were tried. Where was Demdike, you ask? Demdike died in prison, which was something that often happened, especially to the poor who could not afford to pay for any sort of quality confinement. She was also pretty old, so that unfortunately is not that surprising to witchcraft historians that she died in jail. Everyone but Anne was found guilty, but and was tried again on the next day. There's no double jeopardy here. People can be retried after being found not guilty and then subsequently found guilty, and it happens. It's shocking, especially for Americans to hear, but that's part of why the Fifth Amendment was a big deal. On August 19th, Anne, Allison, and several other people caught up in the panic were all tried and found guilty. There were 11 people in total, and 10 of them were executed. One woman named Margaret Pearson was convicted of non-capital witchcraft, meaning she didn't kill anyone with her witchiness, and she was sentenced to being pilloried for 4 consecutive market days in 4 nearby towns, where she also had to make a full confession of her crimes and to be imprisoned for a year. I could not tell you if she made it through all that, but it would surprise me if she had. Sounds like a year of hell to me. The thing that is so exceptional about these trials, apart from the scope and the many tragic outcomes, is that some of the evidence that clinched the case was provided by a child, Jennet Devize, who was only about 9 years old at the time. According to a contemporary description of the trial written by a clerk of the court, James Potts, and hang tight, we'll come back to him in more detail soon. According to Potts, during her examination by Noel, the justice of the peace, Elizabeth Devize, that, quote, barbarous and inhumane monster, wouldn't confess a thing, despite Noel's, quote, very circumspect and exceeding careful dealing with her. That is, quote, until it pleased God to raise up a young maid, Jennet Devize, her own daughter, a witness unexpected, to discover all their practices, meetings, consultations, murders, charms, and villainies. That, combined with her other daughter Allison's testimony and her son James's testimony against her, did Elizabeth in, and she started singing. I kind of suspect that Jennet didn't come forward on her own, but whether that was divine intervention or if divine intervention had a little help from the JP, or if Jennet had a really bad relationship with her family, who can really say what made her come forward? So to answer the question posed at the outset of the episode, what made Jennet Devize testify against her own mother? My good little historians, you already know the answer to that is we just don't know for sure because Jennet never tells us, but we need to consider all the possibilities. The whole thing sounds just really traumatic. Jennet was brought into the courtroom and was told to give her evidence against her mother, who stood at the bar. Elizabeth started crying and shouting and, quote, outrageously cursing. And Jennet started crying, and she told the judges that she couldn't speak in the presence of her mother. All of this sounds perfectly reasonable, if not super messed up to me. Like, of course that's what would happen. The description of the trial also found it necessary to add in the very next paragraph that Elizabeth's left eye sat lower than her right, and that one eye looked up and the other looked down. Potts calls her an, quote, odious witch, strangely deformed, and is all like, no one had ever seen anything like it, and no one could calm her down and get her to stop shouting and threatening Jennet, and so they had to take her out of the courtroom, after which they stood Jennet up on a table and had her tell them what she knew. And she talks about how her witchy mom had a demon visit her in the form of a brown dog named Ball. And Ball wanted Mom to help him kill a man named John Robinson of Barley. And her mom did it. A few years later, Jennet said Elizabeth called for Ball and asked him to help her kill James, John Robinson's brother, and another time a guy named Mitten of Rough Lee. And Ball, according to Jennet, was like, I gotcha. And both these guys died 3 weeks after her mom put in the request. Jennet also talked about that Good Friday party at Malkin Tower, which happened at midnight and during which the witches feasted on beef, bacon, and mutton, and how her mother taught her 2 prayers, one to cure the bewitched and one to get a drink. Purely for informational purposes, I'd like to know what those prayers were, but we do not get details on them. Jennet also testified against James. James, it seems, had a black demon dog named Dandy who did his dirty work. And again, it was because of, quote, the wonderful work of God to raise up a young infant to provide the evidence that helped lead to a conviction and execution. It was not normal for a child to provide evidence in pre-modern English courts or courts outside of England for that matter. It was highly unusual. Kids were not thought to give the most accurate information, especially little girls. But this is at a juncture in witchcraft history where extraordinary crimes called for extraordinary measures, and this devilish conspiracy that stretched far and went back years was just that kind of situation for these Lancashire trials. And here, friends, is where we talk about the source material for the trials. That book published by James Potts, an associate clerk of the Northern Circuit who witnessed the Lancashire trials and who claimed he was asked to write about them by the judges. That book is The Wonderful Discovery of Witches in the County of Lancashire, written in November of 1612 and published in 1613. Because this book was written by an eyewitness relatively close in time to the events it describes, and because it contains a lot of official court records, what happened in August, but also depositions and confessions taken earlier, people treated it as a faithful account of what happened here. And it is, and it isn't. Historian Marion Gibbs talks about Potts' quote, dusty memory, and explains how his account isn't really that straightforward. Potts used formulaic legal documents to tell us what happened here, but those aren't giving you what people actually said. They aren't word for word. You miss a lot of details. And he also adds in his own editorializing comments, like the thing about Elizabeth's eyes and calling people monsters and saying God was involved. And sometimes the order of how things appear in his book wasn't the order they happened in, and the documents that are reproduced aren't necessarily how they were originally, which again was an editorial choice. It was meant to make you think about these trials in a certain way. When the assize judges came into town, they got a list of people being held for trial and the indictments. What Potts gives you with an official heading and dates looks like a jail delivery record, sorta. But he's only talking about these witches and not everyone else awaiting trial. So you just get an edited version that maybe was what the judges got in August of 1612, or maybe was an approximation from memory. He does deliberately leave some things out. If this were a trial like other trials, convicted prisoners were allowed to make a statement before sentencing to raise any special mitigating circumstances that might grant them mercy. Potts leaves this out. Maybe it didn't happen in this case, but if it didn't, it would be unusual, and you'd think Potts would explain its glaring absence. Potts was an expert, so he is a very attractive source in many ways. He'd been around in the system a while. He was involved in the drafting of those formulaic legal documents. He knew his way around the process. He's not just some schmo sitting in the back or hearing about it from Kevin down at the pub. He likes to say things like, quote, upon the record, a lot, and throw in Latin phrases just so you don't forget he's a professional. And Gibson argues that his publisher and printer maybe encouraged that, but at the very least, probably really liked that. Discovery was supposed to be a step up from the more common pamphlets that were printed about witch trials in the 17th century. There is also the consideration that Potts had an agenda in the way he crafted Discovery, and it wasn't all about sales. It was about getting King James on board with the idea that there was an extensive satanic conspiracy at work within England. So King James is pretty well known for being an enthusiastic persecutor of witches, especially in Scotland, where he was known as James VI. He wrote a whole book about it, Demonology, which was first printed in 1597, and it was reprinted in London in 1603. Very famously, King James thought witches tried to sabotage his wedding to Anne of Denmark in 1589, and he personally attended the North Berwick witch trials in Scotland shortly after in 1590. There is a lot of continental witchcraft theory in his demonology book, and continental witchcraft theory is all about the satanic pacts and conspiracies. So most people do tend to assume that James didn't need further buttering up to get him on board with witch trials in England, but England was not Scotland and it was not Denmark, and people did tend to be a little bit more skeptical of witchcraft charges in England. And there is an idea that James maybe had a period of skepticism around the turn of the 17th century regarding witch stuff. And James felt that he personally uncovered fraud in several witchcraft cases. In the Lancashire case, people were convicted and executed based on the testimony of a little girl, and there was a lot of unease about that. And 5 people who were caught up in the larger surrounding panic were later reprieved. James opened an investigation into the fraud, and there were general grumblings about how judges were handling witchcraft cases in Pendle and elsewhere. Stephen Pumphrey writes that this is speculative, and we can't know one way or the other how skeptical James was overall about witchcraft at this time, and I do tend to agree with that. Moreover, the judges Altham and Bromley thought that Lancashire was a backward place filled with residual superstitious-y activity that was thanks to Catholicism, and that hanging, quote, a coven of witches accused of making diabolical compact was a risky career move. The phrasing makes me chuckle, but the point is totally serious. So essentially, Altham and Bromley maybe commissioned discovery as a kind of public damage control. And maybe the story of the Pendle Witches in this book are how the Pendle Witches really were, or the book makes the Pendle Witches conform to James's vision of witchcraft from that demonology book. Continental European beliefs on how witches really worked. Servants of Satan, satanic worship in pacts, diabolical Sabbath gatherings, Malleus Maleficarum witchcraft treatise 101 stuff, the more learned theories of witchcraft. England had a different judicial system that required someone to bring an accusation or a charge against someone, unlike inquisitorial procedure in most of continental Europe, where judges could just do it. And you also had to convince a jury in England, so witchcraft charges tended to follow more popular folkloric ideas of what witches did, rather than the top-down theories about devil worship and apostasy and heresy. Discovery is the first introduction of continental ideas into England, and it models itself off of demonology. And Pumphrey gives you a bunch of similarities of what the Pendle Witches, quote-unquote, did, according to those judges and what James writes about. Most interesting to me is that King James talks about how essentially extraordinary crimes require extraordinary measures. Witchcraft is often talked about as a, quote, crimen acceptum in the sources, and it's kind of an all bets are off, fight dirty because every soul is in danger sort of idea. So yeah, you can have a child testify in court. You can have a girl testify in court. That's fine. Before this, courts in England said you had to be 14 or older to swear the proper oath in court. 14 was the age of reason, but Jennet's testimony changed that in cases of accused witchcraft. When you see child witches and child accusers, it's mostly in the 17th century when the accusations had peaked, and they probably also factored into the decline of witchcraft accusations too. People were really uncomfortable with this, and it struck them as particularly messed up. What was it about the English counties of Lancashire and Yorkshire that made for such fertile ground for a witchcraft outbreak in 1612? It's kind of hard to say why any of these things happened because it's usually a mix of a lot of factors that sometimes take off and sometimes fizzle out. In this particular case, historians often look first to the trial of Jennet Preston, who I mentioned a bit earlier. Her story is told in an appendix to Potts's Discovery, kind of as an afterthought to the whole Chaddox-Demdike Devize story. In this section with Jennet Preston's story, Potts says that he's writing in response to Jennet's supporters, her husband, her family, and her friends, who were outraged at how she was treated at her first trial. And Potts is like, I'm going to explain why Jennet is actually guilty and actually a witch. And he does explain. It's a pretty convoluted story of witchcraft and murder and interesting relationships. But in that first trial, Preston was acquitted. After the acquittal, she allegedly went to Malkin Tower on that Good Friday, and that's her connection to the Pendle Witches. And it's James Devize who tells the authorities about it. And this time, Preston is not so lucky about getting off. Roger Knoll knew the family that was allegedly affected by Preston's witchcraft, and he's the magistrate who questioned Alison and Demdike and Chaddox and Elizabeth and James, and then little Jennet. Other historians have theories about what happened in Pendle that revolve around the social and economic pressures of the area in the early 1600s. Pendle's economy was dependent on cattle and cloth, and those were seeing a hit at this time. And a lot of accusations had to do with misfortunes that befell cows and milk production, and the witches are described as gorging on those things. There were also a lot of religious tensions in the area of Pendle, and historians often point out the tendency for witchcraft accusations to erupt when Catholics and Protestants clashed. Pendle was in Whaley Parish, and it used to have an important and large abbey before Henry VIII got to it. And when it was gone, there was a hit to the local economy that Pendle still hadn't recovered from in 1612. Whaley Abbey had a residual influence over the local populations, and Catholic sentiments were still present in the early 17th century, but there were also a lot of Protestant reformers trying to stamp them out, and that created a lot of unease and social tension. Roger Nowell was one of those reforming Protestants who really wanted to destroy any vestiges of Catholic practice. And there's also the strong possibility that the Pendle Witches were practicing a type of local folkloric magic. There were a lot of cases in the lower courts that had to do with what historians call low magic, regular people engaging in charms and spells and things like that had nothing to do with a grand demonic conspiracy or a pact with Satan, but was magical practice. People just kind of did this, and sometimes it was prosecuted in the courts, and sometimes it wasn't. The Pendle Witches probably were doing it too. It just took on a different life once quote-unquote learned continental theories about satanic pacts and demonic worship were introduced. As for Jennet, you're probably wondering what happened to her. Again, I do and don't have answers for you. You don't always get to follow the end of the thread for characters you meet in historical sources, especially for young girls and for women. But Jennet, we do know something of what happened to her, and unfortunately, it's not good. Jennet fell victim to the precedent she set, and she was accused in 1633, along with 10 other people, of witchcraft by a 10 or 11-year-old boy named Edmund Robinson. He claimed that a woman had taken him to a witch's sabbath where there were 60 people making meat, butter, and milk by pulling on ropes that were attached to the top of a barn. His father suggested some people, and the boy agreed. Yes, those were the people. 19 people were convicted, one of whom was Jennet, who was about 30 years old in 1633. Doubts about the verdicts led the justices of the peace to request an investigation by the Privy Council. The Bishop of Chester was brought in, and the boy admitted he made it all up, and that his father's suggested names were for, quote, envy, revenge, and the hope of gain. And that was the end of things. You'd think that'd be a happy-ish ending for Jennet, but the last known record we have of Jennet is in 1636, and she was still in jail in Lancashire Castle. She couldn't leave until she paid for her room and board, and for someone like Jennet, that was probably impossible. Pretty much nobody comes out good in this story, unless you count the clerk and the judges and the publisher of Discovery. It was not uncommon, especially in England, for witch trials to have a life outside of the courtroom. Printers were busy making leaflets or pamphlets about the trials, and they sold pretty well. But the Pendle story was incredibly popular, and people wrote about it a lot and fictionalized it in print and on the stage. It was this sensational thing that had a life of its own, and Potts's discovery made its way over to the American colonies, and it was one of the things the acting judges in Salem were reading when they were trying to figure out how they should deal with their own outbreak of witchcraft and child witnesses. Thanks for staying spooky with me, Footnoting History friends. If you enjoyed the podcast, please be sure to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on social media. Thank you to all of our Patreon and Ko-Fi supporters. If you're not part of our Patreon, please consider helping us keep Footnoting History open access by joining or by making a one-time Ko-Fi donation or by purchasing some of our merch. And until next time, remember, the best stories are in the footnotes.